Today we will explore the brutal and fascinating world of medieval jousting, the most prestigious and dangerous sport of European chivalry, and how it intertwined with the life and reign of one of the most celebrated monarchs in English history, Henry VIII. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this. Imagine an arena surrounded by thousands of spectators. Colorful banners flutter in the wind while trumpeters announce the start of a confrontation that no one present would dare forget. On one side of the wooden barrier, a knight mounted on a war horse waits, motionless, covered in armor that weighs more than many men could carry while standing. On the other side, his adversary prepares in the same way. Both hold solid wooden lances about 4 meters, 13 feet long. The crowd falls silent for a moment, and then, in a roar of hooves against the packed earth, the two knights charge at each other at a speed that can exceed 30 kilometers per hour, 18 miles per hour. The impact lasts less than 3 seconds. In this brief interval, anything can happen. A lance may shatter against the opponent's shield, drawing applause and shouts of admiration. A wooden fragment may find a gap in the armor and pierce flesh and bone. Or perhaps the blow is so violent that the knight is torn from the saddle and thrown to the ground with the full weight of his armor upon his body. This was the world of jousting, the most prestigious and deadliest sport of medieval tournaments. And this was the sport that Henry VIII of England loved above all others. To understand how jousting came to occupy this place of prominence, it is necessary to go back in time. In medieval Europe, the mounted knight was the most powerful military unit on the battlefield. Training the coordination between knight and mount required constant practice, and it was from this necessity that the first tournaments arose. With the arrival of the Normans in England in 1066, French martial traditions spread throughout the British Isles. In this initial phase, tournaments were chaotic and brutal events, with groups of knights facing off in open fields without clear rules. The violence was such that the Catholic Church went so far as to ban tournaments on several occasions, threatening those who participated with excommunication. Even so, tournaments continued to attract knights from all over Europe, as they offered the chance to demonstrate courage, win fame, and impress courtly ladies with feats of bravery. It was during the reign of Richard the Lionheart, at the end of the 12th century, that tournaments gained massive popularity in England. Over the following centuries, group combat was gradually replaced by individual confrontations between two knights, which would come to be known as the joust. One of the most important innovations was the introduction of the central barrier called the tilt, which evolved from a simple rope into a solid wooden structure that prevented head-on collisions between horses. This innovation transformed jousting from a chaotic military exercise into a regulated and spectacular sport. By the time we reach the Tudor period at the beginning of the 16th century, jousting had already established itself as the most prestigious event of any tournament. The rules were clear and rigorous. Two knights positioned themselves at opposite ends of the central barrier, each mounted on his war horse and wielding a solid wooden lance. At the signal, both launched their horses into a controlled gallop and advanced toward one another. Each charge was called a course, and each course lasted only about 2.5 seconds. In this minimal interval, the knight needed to bring his horse to a speed of about 30 to 40 kilometers per hour, keep it aligned with the barrier, lower the lance at the precise moment, and hit the target. Points were awarded according to the location of the impact. The main objective was to break the lance against two specific areas of the opponent, the shield he carried on his left shoulder or the helmet. Hitting the helmet was considerably more difficult and therefore worth more points and brought more glory to the knight who managed to do so. There were also a series of infractions that could lead to disqualification. Striking the central barrier was forbidden. Passing the lance transversely across the opponent's face was not allowed, and above all, hitting the opponent's horse was a very serious foul, considered profoundly contrary to the code of chivalry. Contrary to what many imagine, the primary goal was not to knock the opponent out of the saddle. The true measure of excellence was the ability to break lances upon the opponent in a precise and elegant manner. A knight who broke multiple lances against his opponents Shield and helmet was considered more worthy of honor than one who simply toppled his rival with a brute blow. The joust was a demonstration of control, precision, and calculated courage. A good knight was one who not only hit his opponent with accuracy, but also presented himself as an open target to be hit. Cowering or flinching was considered cowardly and dishonorable. It was, in essence, a game of mutual courage. But all this elegance and chivalry could not disguise an inescapable reality. Jousting was extraordinarily dangerous. Knights advanced toward each other mounted on war horses that could weigh more than 600 kilograms, over 1,300 pounds, at speeds that transformed a wooden lance into a lethal projectile. Even with the safety measures introduced over the centuries, accidents were frequent and injuries could be terrible. Bone fractures were common, caused by both the direct impact of the lance and falls from the horse. Deep lacerations occurred when lances shattered and wooden fragments penetrated through gaps in the armor. And death, although not an everyday event in jousting, was a real possibility that all participants knew and accepted. One of the most important safety measures was the use of lances with special tips, called coronals. Instead of a sharp steel point that could impale the opponent, the jousting lance ended in a metal piece with 3 blunt points. These 3 points served to distribute the force of the impact over a larger area and to prevent the lance from penetrating the armor. When the coronal hit the opponent's shield, the points dug into the surface, and the pressure of the impact caused the wooden lance to break, dissipating the energy of the blow. It was an ingenious system, but it was far from infallible. Wood fragments could still break off and find their way into the flesh, and the force of the impact was still sufficient to cause serious internal injuries. The armors used in jousting were remarkable pieces of engineering. A jousting armor could weigh up to 50 kilograms, 110 pounds, nearly double that of a battle armor. It was rigid and allowed very little movement, designed specifically to withstand the impact of a lance for fractions of a second. The helmet was extremely heavy and fixed to the breastplate so that no gap existed between the protection of the head and the torso. The visor had to be lowered before each charge, and any failure in this procedure could have catastrophic consequences. On the left shoulder, the knight carried a large shield of reinforced wood, designed to function as an impact surface. The jousting saddle was armored, with high walls that protected the knight and kept him firmly attached to his mount. The horses used in jousting were exceptional animals. The most valued was the destrier, bred and trained specifically for combat. Contrary to the popular conception that imagines gigantic war horses, research indicates that destriers were between 14 and 16 hands high, a size similar to that of a modern hunter horse. What distinguished them was their strength, musculature, and training. They were always stallions, chosen for their fiery temperament. A good destrier cost up to 7 or 8 times the price of an ordinary horse. The horses also received armor. The head was protected by a metal chanfron, the chest by a pétrole, and over everything they displayed decorative caparisons with their knights' heraldic coats of arms. It is into this scene of splendor and danger that the figure of Henry VIII of England enters. Born in 1491, Henry was the second son of Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch. He was not the original heir to the throne. That role belonged to his older brother Arthur, who died prematurely in 1502 at the age of 15. With Arthur's death, the young Henry became the sole heir to the English crown, and his father began to keep him under constant surveillance, forbidding him from participating in activities that could put his life at risk. For an athletic, vigorous young man passionate about sports, this restriction must have been frustrating beyond measure. While kept on the sidelines, Henry could observe other young men of the court participating in tournaments and jousts. Among them, a certain Charles Brandon, a lad about 7 years older than Henry, tall, athletic, handsome, and extraordinarily talented in the arena. Brandon represented everything the young prince desired to be and do. It is possible that Henry lived out many of his sporting fantasies through Brandon during these years of forced confinement. When Henry VII died in April 1509, his 17-year-old son ascended the throne as Henry VIII, and from that moment on, no one could stop him from doing what he had always desired. The young king was an impressive figure by any standard. Contemporary. Accounts describe him as a man of exceptional stature for the time, measuring approximately 1 meter and 88 centimeters, 6 feet 2 inches, with an athletic and muscular build, red hair, and an energy that seemed inexhaustible. He dedicated himself passionately to all kinds of physical activity, from hunting to wrestling, from real tennis to archery. But above all, he loved jousting. For Henry, jousting was not just a sport or a pastime, it was a political statement. In a world where a king's power was constantly judged by his ability to lead armies and inspire respect, Henry's skill in the tournament arena demonstrated to foreign ambassadors, rival nobles, and the general public that the new King of England was a formidable warrior, a courageous leader, and a monarch who embodied the ideals of chivalry. Every lance he broke against an opponent's shield was a message sent to the entire world. Henry VIII's tournaments were not mere sporting events. They were spectacles carefully planned to display the wealth and magnificence of the Tudor court. One of the most extraordinary examples was the Westminster Tournament of 1511, organized to celebrate the birth of Henry's first son with Catherine of Aragon. The tournament was structured as a chivalric allegory inspired by the traditions of the Burgundian court. 4 knights, played by the king himself, and 3 courtiers, embodied characters whose names came from the Roman de la Rose. The Romance of the Rose. Henry took on the role of Coeur Loyal, Loyal Heart. The tournament was preceded by elaborate processions with moving sets that looked like enchanted forests, topped by golden castles. The scores were meticulously recorded and show that Coeur Loyal, Henry himself, was the best performing knight. The king commissioned a pictorial record, the Westminster Tournament Roll, a parchment nearly 18 meters, 60 feet long, that survives to this day at the College of Arms in London. Tragedy, however, closely followed the splendor. The little prince whose arrival in the world had been celebrated with such magnificence died only 10 days after the tournament. The loss was devastating for Henry and Catherine, but the king did not let grief keep him away from the arena. In the following years, he continued to organize and participate in tournaments with a frequency and enthusiasm that impressed even his closest contemporaries. And it is here that the figure of Charles Brandon becomes central to this narrative once again. Brandon, who had been elevated by Henry to the title of Duke of Suffolk in recognition of his talents and the deep friendship that united them, was one of the very few men in England capable of rivaling the king in the arena. The two jousted together frequently, and Brandon was one of the rare opponents who could offer Henry a real challenge. The king himself complained when his adversaries were not up to his standard, even swearing on one occasion that he would never again joust against such mediocre opponents. Brandon was the antidote to this frustration. Records indicate that when the two faced each other, Brandon broke as many lances as the king, demonstrating that Henry's results in the joust were not the product of courtiers allowing themselves to be beaten out of fear or subservience, but a reflection of genuine skill. And here, an inevitable question arises. When a knight jousted against the King of England himself, was any kind of concession made? Was the monarch allowed to win out of courtesy? The answer, according to historical records and contemporary accounts, is no. Any exception would be noticed immediately by the spectators, who included foreign ambassadors, experienced nobles, and deep connoisseurs of the rules and subtleties of the sport. A fabricated victory would have no value, and more than that, would be a humiliation for a king who took pride in his genuine abilities. Henry's performance in the arena depended entirely on his own talent, and it is precisely why his feats were so admired. Women, although they did not participate in the jousting itself, played a fundamental role in the ceremonial and culture surrounding the sport. The entire logic of jousting, in fact, was imbued with the ideals of courtly chivalry, where the knight fought in the name of a lady and sought to honor her with his deeds. Everything that happened in the arena was, in a sense, dedicated to the women watching from the stands. The ladies of the court could choose the best knight of the tournament, grant extra lances to those who had distinguished themselves, and, notably, had the power to disqualify knights who demonstrated unchivalrous behavior. This female authority over conduct in the arena reinforced the idea that jousting was not just a competition of brute force, but a celebration of broader values, where courtesy, elegance, and respect were as important as martial skill. One of the grandest episodes of Henry's career took place outside of England in June 1520, on the plains between Gien and Ardres in northern France. For 18 days, Henry VIII and King Francis I of France met at an event of such opulence that it became known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Organized by Cardinal Thomas Wolsey as a diplomatic summit, the meeting transformed into a veiled competition between the two young kings. Henry brought a retinue of more than 5,000 people and ordered the construction of a temporary palace covering nearly 10,000 square meters, over 100,000 square feet. The French responded with hundreds of tents made of precious fabrics. Henry appeared at a tournament wearing armor adorned with more than 2,000 grams, 4.5 pounds, of gold and more than 1,000 pearls. An important diplomatic decision determined that Henry and Francis should joust on the same side to avoid having to face each other directly. An armor that Henry used in the foot combats of this event survives to this day at the Royal Armouries in Leeds, fitting the king's body like a second skin and revealing a 29-year-old man, 1 meter and 88 centimeters tall, muscular and athletic, and the accidents came. In March 1524, Henry faced Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, in a joust that almost ended in tragedy. The king, eager to test a new armor of his own design, forgot to lower his visor before launching his horse into the charge. Brandon, on the other side of the barrier, was wearing a helmet that severely limited his vision and could not hear the desperate cries of the spectators asking him to stop. The Duke advanced at full speed, and his lance hit the inside of Henry's open helmet, shattering and launching wooden fragments over the king's face. By a miracle, Henry did not lose his sight. The king, demonstrating a magnanimity that would be increasingly rare in his later years, refused to blame Brandon for the incident, declaring that the responsibility was entirely his for not having lowered the visor. Brandon, deeply shaken, swore he would never again joust against the king. Henry, however, did not take this oath seriously. He needed opponents of his caliber, and Brandon was one of the few who could provide them. 9 months later, the two were again on opposite sides of the barrier. But the 1524 accident was only a prelude. 12 years later, on January 24, 1536, during a tournament at Greenwich Palace, Henry suffered the accident that many historians consider a turning point in his life and reign. The king, then 44 years old, was no longer the athletic young man of 1520. His body had changed considerably. He had gained significant weight, weighing more than 125 kilograms, 275 pounds, and suffered from painful ulcers on his legs that made his movements difficult. His doctors advised him to give up jousting, but Henry, stubborn as ever, refused to accept that his body was no longer up to his ambitions. On that January day, while jousting in full armor, his horse stumbled and fell on top of him, trapping him under the combined weight of the animal and the armor. Witnesses reported that the king remained unconscious for 2 hours. The entire court panicked. Courtiers ran back and forth, convinced that the king had died. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis recorded that rumors of Henry's death spread quickly, and that Anne Boleyn, then pregnant, reportedly suffered a miscarriage upon hearing the false news. The loss of the child deeply shook Anne's position at court, contributing to the chain of events that would culminate in her execution only 4 months later. Henry survived the 1536 accident, but many historians argue that the man who emerged from that arena was never the same again. Modern theories suggest that the king may have suffered a traumatic brain injury that permanently altered his behavior. The Henry of the years before 1536, although already showing signs of a volatile temperament and egocentrism, was also capable of generosity, magnanimity, and genuine affection for those around him. The Henry of the years after 1536 became progressively more paranoid, more cruel, and more unpredictable. This behavioral transformation, which was previously attributed solely to political stress and absolute power, has come to be seen by some researchers as possibly related to the cumulative effects of multiple head traumas suffered over decades of participation in jousting and other contact sports. It is a hypothesis that remains under debate, but one that adds a fascinating and disturbing layer to the story of one of the most complex monarchs in English history. Henry was not the only king to suffer the consequences of jousting. On June 30th, 1559, King Henry II of France participated in a tournament in Paris to celebrate the Peace of Cateau-Cambrésis and the marriage of his daughter Elizabeth to Philip II of Spain. The king, then 40 years old, wearing the colours of his mistress Diane de Poitiers, faced Gabriel de Montgomery, captain of his Scottish Guard. After a charge in which Montgomery almost unhorsed him, Queen Catherine de Medici and courtiers begged Henry to stop. But the king insisted. In the next charge, Montgomery's lance hit the king's helmet and shattered. A fragment penetrated through the visor, pierced Henry's right eye, and lodged in his brain. The best doctors of the time, including Ambroise Paré and Andreas Vesalius, were called, but the damage was irreversible. Henry II died 11 days later. His death marked the end of jousting as a sport practiced by monarchs in France. Returning to England, jousting was not accessible to just anyone. The costs were immense: war horses, squires, armourers, blacksmiths. The armour itself was a colossal investment, not only functional but also a work of art, decorated with engravings and gilding. Consequently, jousting was practiced by kings, dukes, earls and barons, the men at the top of the social pyramid. The knight's emotional state was as important as technical skill. A good knight needed to be completely calm. If he was stressed or angry, this disturbance would be transmitted to the horse, which could veer off or react in an unpredictable manner. Harmony between knight and mount was essential for success. Charles Brandon remained at Henry VIII's side throughout almost his entire life. In 1515, Brandon committed high treason by marrying Mary Tudor, the king's sister, without royal permission. Henry, although furious, quickly forgave his friend. Brandon accompanied the king through the political storms of his reign, including the break with Rome and his multiple marriages. He was one of the few friends Henry never ordered to be executed. When Brandon died in August 1545, the king declared that he had been one of his best friends, always loyal and generous, and ordered that he be buried with great ceremony in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, where Henry himself would be buried less than 2 years later. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, at the age of 55. His body, devastated by years of excess, disease, and the cumulative effects of a life dedicated to the most violent sports of his time, no longer resembled the slender and vigorous athlete who had enchanted Europe in 1520. But his legacy as England's most celebrated royal knight remained intact. The armours he wore, the scrolls that recorded his deeds, the scorecards that documented his victories, all this survived the centuries and continues to fascinate historians and museum visitors to this day. Jousting gradually disappeared throughout the 17th century, replaced by other forms of equestrian entertainment and rendered obsolete by the evolution of military technology. But the fascination with this sport never vanished. Since the 1970s, historical reenactment groups have dedicated themselves to recreating medieval jousting with replica armour and wooden lances. The royal armouries in the United Kingdom regularly promote demonstrations that attract thousands of spectators, serving as a living reminder of a tradition that for centuries defined what it meant to be noble, to be brave, and to be a knight. Looking back, it is impossible not to feel admiration for the strange beauty of medieval jousting, a sport that required strength, precision, unwavering courage, and a willingness to put one's own life at risk in the name of honour. Henry VIII, with his overwhelming passion, perfectly embodied this culture. The accidents of 1524 and 1536 left permanent marks on his body and possibly his mind. But even when his body longer obeyed the ambitions of his will, Henry refused to abandon the arena. Had he maintained his health, many believe he would have continued to joust until the last day of his life. And that is the kind of story that medieval jousting tells us, a story of bravery, vanity, glory, and consequence, echoing through the centuries like the distant thunder of warhorse hooves in an arena that no longer exists. If this narrative captured your imagination and transported you to the arenas of the 16th century, consider this an invitation to continue exploring. Subscribe to the channel to follow more documentaries like this. Leave your comment telling us which aspect of medieval jousting most caught your attention, and don't forget to leave a like. Just like the knights who broke their lances in search of honor and recognition, your support is the force that drives us to continue telling the most fascinating stories in history. Until the next charge.